Alright, we've made it a little bit farther with our website. We're just going to play around with that today. Alright, so let's open that up. I may have to duck out at some point. My youngest daughter is taking a nap, but I'm trying to help out a little bit today since Mother's Day was yesterday. Let's see here. So let's start this up. Using yarn, running an npm script. Yarn runs serve. Kicks up that Webpack dev server. Hosted at 8080. If we upgrade to the latest Vue CLI, that'll be Webpack 4, but I believe we're using Webpack 3.0 right now. So let's see what that looks like. There we go. Cool. So you can see we've made a little bit of progress. We have this top section that's fairly responsive. So you'll see our logo goes from Coffee Driven Dev. At tablet width drops to CDD. At mobile width, the text drops off. And then we have Flexbox kind of changing the layout. We have we assume our width will always be 400, which is a little bit false. On older iPhones, you'll see a width of like 320. But newer smartphones, 400s, usually the minimum, or roughly around 360. So you'll see this all kind of update dynamically. Oh, and there we go, back to tablet, back to full screen. You see our card metaphor kind of drops away at lower widths, and we just have these guys right here. So we've cleaned it up a little bit already. So we have like arrow navigation, and it's kind of working. We just need to make sure that these elements snap to disabled and not hidden when we get outside of the bounds, and we need to be able to handle that. They still scroll at mobile resolutions using tap or force. And we need to also make sure that we can handle it if there are next to no elements in this container, and then we'll clean up the styles that are under here. If we have time, we'll try to pull in some actual content, either programmatically via an API for YouTube or for something like Firebase if we want to store them that way. Same thing with Medium posts, and then we'll start looking at the About Us pages where we have some page transitions to kind of iterate between the different people that are going to be contributing to this Twitch team. Alright, and so you see that we also switched from the embedded player to there's just like what's called like the Twitch player. So it'll include overlays and things like that in the actual player. It just has some restrictions around what size it can be. But it does give you the ability to have like a dynamic width and height in terms of percentage rather than just the static pixel. I think that's just a difference in the type of element they use to embed. Whereas with one, you'd almost need to debounce a callback to kind of change the size. But if we do it like this, it can just be responsive. So there's a little less overhead in figuring that out. Alright, so let's throw this over on the right. So the first thing first is I kind of want the arrows that we're using to navigate this section to stay in place even when they're not there, and they also need a hover effect. Let's go back to our home. We have our left and right arrows here. You can see we kind of have some computed properties that indicate those states, so show video left and show video right. And they're keyed off of whether or not we've kind of passed that left or right bounds. And we'll probably try to make those a little bit more reusable so that way they can apply to both of these scrolling containers, not just the top one. But I really just want to get it working with the top one first, and then we'll make it a little bit more dynamic. Alright, let's get them both visible. Let's just work on this hover effect. So I think we can just kind of, on hover, kind of maybe lighten the arrow or darken it a little bit and make the whole background itself a little bit darker, just like a different shade of white almost. So you see it's in a container, this navigation left arrow. So we can probably just use navigate arrow. Let's find where that's at in here. Okay. So we're using SAS. Let me move the code over to the right because you probably care more about seeing that. We'll move this guy over to the left. And I mean, since you're all here, I don't know if we need the comments box right now, so I might actually drop that so you don't see it on the actual feed. So I have, let's see, chat box. Let's hide that. So that should make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. There you go. Alright, so we have our navigate arrows. Let's add that hover effect. Again, I still need to get back in there and change my editor settings so it applies my preferences for prettier and my linter by default on save and as we're typing. It's a little annoying. It'll probably be something I clean up one of these off periods when you're not watching me. Alright, so hover. Let's just try... something like that first. So when we hover, you can kind of see it gives us a slightly darker appearance. It's a little bit clearer what's going on. But we'd also want probably a cursor. Cursor pointer. That's going to get your normal hyperlink. Yeah, so there we get our little hand. Let's actually change the fill of that arrow if we can. I'm not sure if this will do it or not since it's not on the actual SVG, but let's just try something bold like that to see if it works. So that's not going to do that. That's fine. So we can probably just change the opacity of the entire container, and then it will affect that arrow a little bit better. Because it applies to everything that's underneath it as well. Opacity. Or everything that's contained inside of that, the opacity will be applied to. So that's kind of a way to achieve like lightening it. So you'll see it looks lighter now when we do that. Maybe 0.7. A lot of times it likes it if you have a prefacing 0. And let's see, is there a shade a little bit darker than? Let's see. There we go. I think that's pretty good. And then maybe on click or active, we'll make it a little bit darker still. So active, because you'd still be hovering, so we really just need to change background color. So this is interesting. You can do something like this. Darken this color 10%. It's like a SAS function. It's built in, and it will just kind of give you a darker version of that same thing. And so that's a way to just kind of consistently say for any hover or click effects, if you just want to darken or lighten by a specific percentage, you can just use that. So there we go. So then let's apply that same treatment here, right? So if we're already using SAS functions, maybe we'll just say what we really want to do. Let's darken this by 4%. And we'll continue to darken this by 10. Only since we're going from white, maybe we'll do 6 and 12. Alright, and so what we actually want to happen, instead of these just completely disappearing, is we probably just want to apply a dynamic class. And when that class is applied, we'll probably just hide the SVG element rather than having the whole container disappear. Because you see it kind of gives us that jump. So let's fix up the formatting here. Let's find our arrows. So right now you can see we're using vShow, but we don't really want that. We want to apply a specific class. And so we'll call that class disabled, and we'll make it conditional based off that property. So when show video left is true, we do disabled. So we want the opposite of that. So when show video left is false, we want disabled. And we'll do the same thing down here. If you're tuning in, feel free to ask any questions or if there's anything you want to look at. I know we're showing at a slightly different time than normal, but it's... and I might start showing just a little bit earlier, but we'll see. So same thing here, show video right, disabled. So let's find our navigate arrow and then just add a disabled class. Alright, so similar to how we can apply these stylings when we're hovering or when we're active, we can just say, hey, when this class is also disabled, let's find that SVG element, right? SVG. Really just want the contents to not be there. So maybe we'll just make opacity 0 as like a way to get around that. Still there. Oh, well, see, that doesn't quite do it, does it? So disabled, we probably also need to disable our hover and active effects unless we can figure out a better way to do this. So let's try that. So this has more specificity, so we're going to move that beneath hover and active. Let's go ahead and fix the indentation here. Default background color. We might actually just need to make sure the opacity for all those is gone too, but with the default cursor. So let's simplify this a little bit. Hey, Slayer Darth. I'm not sure what O-arm means. Look like you're a person that's like trying to wave, but you've had one of your arms cut off. So what's new with you today? So again, we're just updating so that our hover and active styles don't mess with these arrows. So we're going to have disabled, and then we're just going to make sure this applies to... Yeah, alright, what do you do for a living? A code janitor. Are you working at a larger company where you do more refactoring or maintenance or testing or inherited shared? Ooh, that doesn't sound fun at all. You think you're going to stay there? You think you're going to look for somewhere else if you can answer that while on a work computer? Alright, cool, man. So I guess is your primary experience based then in just shared hosting PHP? So do you maintain your own servers? Are you doing something like DreamHost and you just have like a single box? Yeah, no, so you see that a lot. Well, and that makes sense though, right? So if you're building a bunch of WordPress sites, you're probably building them, what, for small businesses at like $2,000 to $15,000 a pop, and you just try to get them created in just like 1 to 5 days, and then you're hands off, but then you do maintenance for a fee. It's pretty common for like a local web shop that's catering to small businesses that are nearby. It's actually like a kind of place that I got my start at, but maybe similar to you, you were tired of using libraries and just hammering out the same thing every day and maintaining them too. So you're looking for something else. Yeah, no, I feel you. Just a bunch of stuff glued together to get things to kind of work. So the place I worked at, they recently actually transitioned to doing almost exclusively WordPress stuff, but when they did .NET stuff, they used a tool called DevExpress, which are like drop-in components that you just kind of provide configuration to, and then you're done. So it felt less like you were programming and more like you were configuring 24/7. So we have that working. So let's see if we can fix that up to do multi-scroll and then also apply to that bottom scrolling container too. Oh, thanks. Oh, I can't pronounce. Is that Emmy Aregis for following 6 minutes ago? I just picked up on that. Thank you. Oh, all right. So you're just experimenting with languages at this point. Yeah. No, it's fun, right? To just try to be able to do things either with vanilla or just your own specific stuff. Although there is something to be said for pulling in the occasional library, especially if you're doing anything with JavaScript or on the C# side. Like, packages can be really helpful for really complex behavior that would just be hard to reinvent yourself. Like, there's one I was looking at earlier today. It's called Critical CSS Webpack Plugin. Yeah. So this one's actually kind of nuts, right? So if you want to be... Oh, thanks for the follow, Slayer Darth. Yeah, yeah. So this one's really cool where what it does is you want to be able to load your page as fast as possible. So if you have a really large app, you have a bunch of CSS that needs to load first. And if you have hundreds of routes or even 10 or 15 routes, that can be a lot of custom CSS that's render blocking. So what this does is it'll load up your home page and it will, using like Phantom, identify all of the styles that are needed to generate the stuff that's above the fold in that initial render. It'll pull it out and it will inline those styles at the top of your header. And then your style sheet, it will kind of preload in. So what happens is once that initial critical CSS is loaded, you're now being able to render sometimes with just a few kilobytes of CSS. And then all of the important stuff is kind of loaded in the background in a non-blocking fashion. So you can get some crazy good load times with it. But it's maintained by Anthony Gore, and it's using a plugin under the hood by the same guys that do the... I'm not sure if you've played with this, but if you inspect and go to audits, there's something called like a lighthouse audit that will tell you how fast your website can load in not great conditions, and it gives you a bunch of tips on how to make sure that you get kind of better performance. And so there's it's made by Google. It's just called like the Lightbox audit. But it's pretty cool. And so this is one of the things that you can do to kind of increase those load times. But by default, when you run this, if it looks like it's giving you really weird times, it's because it actually slows down your network traffic to simulate 3G network speeds at 4 times slower the rate. So it does a lot of things, actually. So if you look at the audits, it'll tell you performance. So it'll tell you which CSS files are blocking, which JS files are blocking, how long each of them take to come in, how long it takes for your first page to render. So here, let me just run it on. You can watch it kind of run on npm.js as it does this audit. It also does a bunch of stuff for if you're trying to create like a progressive web app, to make sure that you're kind of hitting all those checkboxes, like using service workers, caching files so subsequent visits are faster, and a bunch of crazy stuff too. So it's still just running through its audit and doing some measurements, and it's going to generate a little report for us to look at here in a second. And again, so this is at 3G speeds, 4 times slowdown, so that way you can get like a real, like under crazy GT metrics. I'll have to check that out. I haven't heard of that. So you'll see right here that performance, it gets a 54, progressive web app at 55. There's other audits it can run. So you can see here that one of the bigger things that's slowing this down is that this specific page is slowed down because there's a lot of unused CSS that needs to load before it can render its content. So first meaningful paint was at about 3.5 seconds. First interactive was at about 9 seconds. So again, 3G speeds, 4 times slowdown. So it's going to be much faster on modern connections, but it gives you a better idea of where you can kind of shave off and really start to do stuff fast. And it got like a 74 out of 100 on the perceptual speed index, which is one of the metrics that matter most. And it tells you all the style sheets and scripts that you can try to accomplish and all the different things you can do to kind of increase that time. It'll even give you a little checklist for if you're trying to make your thing a progressive web app. Yeah, no, preprocessors help, uglifying your code. There's a lot of different things you can do now as part of your pipeline and your build step to really reduce that. But I feel like a lot of it is focused around like tree shaking JavaScript and things like that. But you don't see as much focus on CSS, at least not like out of the box as part of templates for the more modern frameworks. So it's always nice to see things like this that are focusing on it and you're also seeing kind of more of a push to server-side rendering too to kind of combat that. So that way you don't necessarily have as much blocking stuff on first page load. No, but huge fan of Sass. Let's see here. Alright, so we got this first little container working. Let's just apply that to the second container, and then again we're going to clean up these styles a little bit and make our methods that are kind of iterating over these better, and then try to pull in the content for these dynamically. Probably YouTube, Twitch, and Medium. Yeah, well, it's hard, right? So part of the argument from the React community is that when you write CSS, it's very tightly coupled to your component. Yeah, a lot of people do use way too much specificity. So the React people argue that because your CSS is tightly coupled to your component, it's pretty clear when you're no longer using it and when you can kind of throw it away. But you have a different problem, right? Where if you just have one giant style sheet, it can be really hard to justify removing a style because you're not sure when or where it's used. So a lot of times what happens is when you want to accomplish effect, you just provide a more specific selector to override the existing selector, and okay, your use case is covered, but you didn't break anything. So a CSS almost becomes like an addition thing, and it's very hard for you to rewrite stuff that you can, and then just kind of like pull out the stuff that you're no longer using because you have that fear that you're going to remove something important. But again, you get rid of that when you have CSS in JS, or if you're using some plugins as part of your pipeline to identify what CSS you're no longer using. So you use utility classes, right? Have you ever played with Tailwind? Yeah, no, those are pretty popular. So so this guy's also a Twitch streamer, but he writes Tailwind and he does some stuff with Vue.js as well. But it's a pretty popular utility class library, and it's decently small. And there's a whole bunch of really good video series on using it. I'd honestly recommend it if you're trying to accomplish something similar. Yeah. All right, back to this. Then anyone else feel free to chime in, or Slayer Darth, if there's anything else in particular that you want to talk about, feel free. I may have to duck out. I have a 1-month-old that's sleeping in the room next to me, and I may have to take her downstairs to my wife here in a minute if she starts crying. I work from home. I'm not just unemployed and twitching for fun. Let's see here. So we just need to duplicate this. Left arrow. I may make this a separate custom component as well. So we're going to have a different ref for these. Navigate right. So this isn't a video deck, it's a clips deck, so we'll call it that. Oh man, I've been trying to keep her away from seeing code. I want to be able to sleep at night, and I'm afraid it haunt her dreams. Let's see. So we'll call this clips deck. We'll update this to point to that reference. Do the same thing for the row. And so when we add a ref, it just gives us the ability to programmatically access that DOM object in Vue. So as part of the VM, it becomes this cache refs, and then the name of the ref. If you have multiple with the same name, they kind of get popped into an array. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll add more. Okay, and you're seeing that the arrow disappears on both, and it's because they're all the logic in that scroll right and scroll left is tied to these elements and not necessarily the new ones for this separate row. So we need to make them agnostic of that. They should be able to, or dynamic, in that they can handle whatever row that we're scrolling on. I think we're going to want to update this too, so that way we're scrolling more than one. And we kind of already have that in place, right? So we're going by this card width times 3 or by times 1. So we'll make our new position 3 cards that we'll scroll through at once. Yes, you'll see we get to the end much faster that way. And this is just updating that dot scroll left property on this overflow X container. By default, the browser's handling the scroll event. We could update that automatically ourselves. And when you use a library like jQuery, that's kind of what it does. It'll either animate that property and use something like the animation frame rate to iterate over it, or it'll have like a combination of promises and set timeouts to kind of do that smoothly. Yeah. No. So, I mean, you can find companies that'll allow you to work from home. The company I'm at right now, they provide office, like a desk, laptop, monitors, and they themselves, like, it's a 100% remote company. So it makes it easier for them to get and allow that because they don't have office space. It also helps keep kind of the cost of running the business down. I think there's like 15 or 20 employees, so it's a little bit smaller. But there are a decent number of companies now that are kind of more open to allowing remote, just because I think it's easier to attract tech talent in our fairly competitive field. Check my text real quick. All right. So let's look at the scroll again. So you can see here that we're doing this thing where on scroll left you pass in a card container but not a parent, and that's the DOM element. And on scroll right we're passing in the card container and the parent container. And we're using those to calculate what the max scroll is and whether or not we're toggling these show video rights or show video lefts on or off. So again, we're just kind of using this blanket for both of these, so we just need to separate that out. I'm not too worried about making this super decoupled, super reusable, because it's not going to get much more complex than this. Ideally, though, we'd make it so that we could add an infinite number of rows and it can handle all of them. I'm okay with just having 2 instances, because anything else might kind of be over-engineering this. So we can do show clips left, false, show clips right, true. So we're defaulting left to false because it's automatically, when the page loads, going to be at that far left position. So you know those arrows aren't going to need to show. And the far right one, assuming that we have more content than can be shown in that container, that should be enabled by default. Okay. I'm not sure how anonymous your account is, but I'd be interested in seeing your GitHub account if you're comfortable sharing that. Let's see here. Oh, that's awesome. Huh. Ruby's really taken off. Look at that DHH making something super popular. Alright. So we're going to key off not show videos left for these, but show clips left. And it can be. So you have to worry a little bit, though, right? Like, you don't only want to hire people that work that do work outside of work hours. It's okay if when you're done with your 9-to-5 programming job, you go fish or rock climb or do whatever you want. All right, I'll check that out. Yeah, cool. 40 different repos. Good commit history. No, that's sweet, man. Yeah, I'll give you a follow. So mine's going to be skewed because we do all of our code on GitHub, so it's going to look like I do way more open source work than I do. But there's mine. Most of my open source work is for an organization called Cornerstone. It's like a medical image viewer. But huge fan of the open source stuff. But yeah, again, I don't think people should hire solely based off GitHub stuff, but I do think it's a nice feather in your hat to show that you're passionate about it and that you do play with it, not just at work. Oh, cool. All right. So looking at this, we do have that arrow separation a little bit, but I broke something when I changed. So let's pop up the inspector. Pew, yelling at me. We don't open source all our tools, so you can have private repositories, and they'll still add to your activity on GitHub. But the main open source library that we use to power one of our products is by that organization called Cornerstone. So over time, I just contributed enough to it that I was made a maintainer. And so it's nice because it helps me keep a pulse on it and help kind of steer its direction while also contributing back to the community that allows us to kind of build our core product, which is like an online DICOM viewer. So you can see like a really simple implementation of Cornerstone. Let's see if I can find the website. I think it's just cornerstonejs.org. So you'll see here, it's like pulling in a medical image. You can do leveling, which is like iterating over all the pixel values and applying like a kind of like a transformation. There's zooming, scaling, and there's a whole tool library that goes along with it. Yeah, it's getting nuts what you can do, especially now that service workers and web workers are coming in to the scene. So I think one of the bigger limitations have been just the fact that a lot of the stuff that you need resources for on desktop, you didn't have access to on web. But even now, you have more and more access to things like that, especially with like the advent of Electron and being able to kind of embed inside of that shell and then gain access to like desktop resources. All right. So those errors are fine. Let's just look here at this. So I think that arrow should just disappear, and it's not. And I think it's because, again, we're keying off this specific container. So let's look at this. Yeah, because you'll see that when we scroll right, I think this arrow actually disappears. Yeah. No, that's pretty cool, right? So this isn't using it, but we actually just used there's a Webpack plugin for Workbox. Workbox, Google. Yeah, no, that's I think one of the best use cases for service workers. It's just that offline ability. So there's a Webpack plugin for Workbox that'll generate most of that for you. And so if we have, for example, in our production app, over 206 like individual modules because of code splitting. This will pre-cache all of them when you first load, and it also has stuff for caching all of your Google fonts and all kinds of stuff. And it makes your app completely usable, so long as you also potentially cache some data in some other routes. Instead of just getting like a, sorry, your website can just kind of work offline. It's a little crazy. And you're right, it's just because it intercepts those network requests and it returns those files as if it were hitting your server. So you get both a performance boost, but you also gain the ability to have offline access. Thanks for the follow, Rigster. Feel free to chime in with stuff. It's cool to see all of you up so early. I guess I don't know what time zones you're in. Let's see here. Yeah, service worker can be a pain to get working locally. I mean, so I guess you could always do Let's Encrypt and have a cert created for you that way, but I'm trying to think of how I actually test it locally. So I think let me see if I can just pull that up for you. ignore my terrible folder structure. So pull this up. So I have I cheat a little bit to get this working with Webpack. So I installed HTTP server, and what we'll do is when I want to test my service worker, I'll just do like yarn run dev :sw, and it will launch everything that's been output into my dist folder. And that seems to work fine. I'm able to kind of deregister or update my service worker that way, and kind of see all the output for it. But it's hard to get it to work with the Webpack dev server. It looks like it actually replaces the server worker stuff that's pulled in by default. And I think part of that is you don't want to pollute that local host with the service worker, because if you think about it, you may be developing multiple things, and it's weird for it to intercept requests for a project that it's not actually tied to. But when you use something else, yeah, it can pull it in. So that's how I cheated for that. And then I have here's what this file looks like. So there's two different ways when you're using the Webpack plugin to kind of pull in or create a service worker. So by default, you can just set it up to create one for you automatically, and it will inject everything you need. But if you want more control, let's see here. I think it's in my view config. So you see, yeah. So PWA, this is kind of the manifest stuff up top, and then this stuff right here is everything that applies to this service worker. So this is the config for Workbox. So there's two different kinds of ways it can generate, and one's the inject manifest, which is the more intense one, where you provide a source file and then an output, and then this bit right here automatically registers it for you, and then this bit is your custom service worker file, and you can delete literally all of this except for this, and it will be the equivalent of kind of like the lighter weight version, and all it's really doing is pre-caching those routes that are auto-generated for you in like a key value array by Webpack. Then this extra stuff here is to cache Google Fonts to make sure that Google Analytics events sync after the browser reconnects, and some stuff to just make sure that I'm pre-caching anything that might be on a CDN. But I think Adi Samana, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, has a bunch of these snippets kind of saved up there in a gist, and Workbox has like some advanced and beginner stuff that you can kind of pull in, like common recipes for caching different kinds of resources. All right. So let's look at this again. So it's not always show video right that we need to care about, so we just need to make sure that we're checking the correct things. So I think the logic at end still applies because we're using parent and we're using the container that are passed in. So the issue is that we're not always updating the right button. So I guess I could add that. How can I do it in a really good dynamic way? So maybe we'll do card navigation. We'll do clip left, false, clip right, true, video left, false, video right, true. And so then I don't know if I like that. I guess we could just get kludgy and say which buttons we care about. So card container. Then we'll do man, yeah. It might almost be easier if I make these custom components, because then these could be properties in the components, and then you can apply a scroll left or a scroll right to the component, and then we'd automatically have reference to those arrow buttons, instead of trying to kind of do all of this in just one global space. So that's probably what I'm going to do, because we're already kind of recreating it for each of these. So we'll go ahead and create a CardDeckRow component, CardDeckRow. So we have CardDeckRow, and we have card. What we don't have is a CardDeckRow. So let's go ahead and do that. New file. And now that we're inside of it, we can just use that Sarah Drasner quick snippets thing where I can just type vbase tab, and it's going to give me the default template that I need to kind of create that view single file component. If we head back to home, we're really just going to be redoing this whole thing right here. Let's pull that out, put a placeholder, hop back into our custom component. Boop. So we need to pull these styles in. We could probably drop that ref, since that's just what this thing is now. So we want the styles for CardDeckRow and our navigate arrows. So we should be able to pull our arrows in too. So let's see. Yeah, almost all this is going to get pulled in, which is nice because it doesn't necessarily need to pollute our home view. One sec. Text from my wife. Let's see. Yeah, so all this seems to be specific to what we're trying to do. So we'll leave home card and H2 styling in there. So you'll see this is much simpler, and it really only applies to the stuff that we're using here. So we'll need to make sure this is using the correct preprocessor. You can use stylus, you can use less, you can use a bunch of different stuff in there. By default, it might yell at you if you need to specifically install like Node SAS or something like that. Let's go ahead and import this so we can kind of watch this happen. And you'll see that we can probably move all this stuff in there too. So we'll kill that. I think it's components. Let's pull each of these in now. And these little card deck arrow components are really just wrapped SVGs. We can probably clean that up later. Fix all. Alright, so now we're going to want to pull in the whole row that we're using. CardDeckRow from components, just an alias that points to that folder location for all of our components. Now it's yelling at us. Good. Okay, so it's yelling at us because we're using a global style variable in this component that we haven't imported. So we just kind of have a file that has all of the variables for our solution. There's a way to kind of inject it globally, but for now we're just including in each of our component files. Just another configuration thing that's nice to have for later on. Now that we have this in here, so what happens when we do cdd CardDeckRow? We'll do that. Oh, there it is. So we have the styling for it, but we're not going to have any of the logic of the variables that drive that. But you'll see that just popped up pretty easily. So we at least have it styled correctly. And these scroll left and scroll right methods we'll be able to pull into here. But it's nice because now we don't necessarily need to pass these DOM methods or these DOM objects because they just kind of apply to everything that's already in here. Scroll left and scroll right. And then we just need some kind of way to track. Where is it at? Track whether or not that these things are showing with those computed values. So we'll steal these and card width. So we don't even really need the data here. And so you see we're making this a lot simpler, and the data is only ever really owned by the component that needs it. It's not just persisted everywhere. So we'll do vdata, boop. Again, just that Sarah Drasner stuff. Paste this in here. Let's go ahead and apply all the fixes for the linting. So this is working. We clearly broke quick clips, which is fine because it's really just all layout logic anyway. So let's go ahead and just delete that out of the home route because we don't really need that right now anyway. And so you'll see here when you look at our home layout, this is way simpler, right? It's much easier to figure out what's going on from like a layout perspective. Like, oh, there's our card deck row for video. There's our card deck row for quick clips. It's very easy to see what's going on. And if I ever want to modify any of this functionality, I just have to dive into that component to get a better idea. Even the style. Like, this is a very simple view component. And then everything that's been pulled out into the actual component that's driving these more complex items can be managed here. And we don't need to worry about passing DOM elements anymore because, again, these methods now live on each DOM element that's kind of created, right? So before we were trying to reuse them. So I guess technically that method would only exist in code in one place, but multiple things could use it. But now technically the method exists on each component. If you think about each component kind of as a class, and each class having like a method that you can call on it. So like I could say, hey, create a new row, and that new row has a method on it called scroll left and scroll right, versus having like global scroll left and scroll right methods that you can pass a component to. So technically it exists in more places, but it's much cleaner, both the logic and everything else with it. So if we did want to unit test a specific bit of code, it's much easier to reason about instead of having to kind of mock all this stuff. Alright, so I've been streaming for almost an hour, and my daughter's getting really close to waking up. So I could have to hop off at any moment, just a heads up. So if you have any questions, I think down below there's a way to hop to our Discord channel. You can follow me on Twitter, or you can always whisper at me if you'd like. And again, anytime you have any questions, I'm always happy to deviate and answer those instead of just working on whatever project I happen to be tinkering with. And I think we also have a GitHub repository if you want to propose different projects. So I do stuff in C#.NET, specifically .NET Core, stuff with Vue.js, and I'm always playing with different APIs. Might even do like nitty-gritty stuff if you really want to see it on stuff like JWT token authentication, using like Auth0 or Firebase. Lots of different things we can do. All right. So now that we have all this in here, let's try to simplify this logic so we aren't passing in references. So let's make sure we don't have any references lingering. Ref, yeah, we don't need those. So we'll just call scroll right. And scroll left. We're just calling the method. We're not necessarily passing any parameters. Show left arrow. Show right arrow. So it might be simple to also just change these to hides, right? So that way you're not having to do the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. But we'll do one thing at a time to clean these up. So maybe we will keep these vref. There we go. So we're just kind of updating it so the refs are more hard-coded instead of needing to be passed in. And we can do that here too. Card container. So we're good. So the next thing we need is probably parent, because I think right now it just assumes that it's there. And we're only using that in the bottom. Let's make sure we were passing in the right variable though. So let's zoom out. We'll hop back to this. What did we call the card container? So the second item was parent, so that's parent. This is going to be the child, the actual. There we go. So let's reapply these. Pull this off, and we'll add this to this guy. We'll do it here, so that way we have consistency where we're specifying that ref first. vref card container. Separate these out. It's probably not great practice, but I like to kind of separate these sections when we do stuff like this. So we're kind of like, hey, we're pulling something in from the DOM. So let's make it a little bit more obvious that it's a little bit different from these variables that we're newing up or doing calculations on. They're like computed values before we can do our math. Parent. So we don't need that here. And why is that yelling at us? Ah, that's why. Good. That's why we're removing it. So let's pop it in underneath card container. Let's see if this still works. Something's yelling at us. We're probably pulling in something weird. So let's see. Inspect. 211 errors. Okay. Okay, yeah, so we changed those names. Let's do show left arrow. Show right arrow. And then delete these other two values that we're no longer using. If at any point in time I'm not talking loud enough, or if you can't see anything on the screen, feel free to call that out too. Ref. It's not vref, it is just ref. There we go. Nuke this, refresh this. Let's see what's going on. That's fine. Alright, so this is working. Our arrow's not updating, but it's because that value is no longer the same, so... What is this? Show right arrow. Show left arrow. And show right arrow. So we've kind of pulled all that logic out. We've kind of refactored it into being a reusable component. And ultimately, we'll just bind data to it for these card views, and then it'll just work. Also, we have the benefit of, if we change any code specific to this, it now applies to anything else that is a card deck row. We can also use each of the components that are in here individually if we don't want to use them with this. And it also gives us the ability to kind of do fancy stuff, right? Where, so maybe we have the first 50 of these items loaded, but maybe there's another 50, and as we approach the end of our container, we start pulling in data to populate those, kind of like a lazy load approach. So that way, again, we can get that first render much faster. It really is just kind of like paging, but horizontal. So we'll probably clean up these styles. We'll make these variables not show, but rather hide, so we're not doing the opposite. And we'll start to pull in this data dynamically by hitting either an API, or we'll cache it somewhere nightly and then pull that in using something like Firebase. Because again, all of this is hosted on GitHub, and anytime we save these changes, our CI integration is pulling them down, building them, and pushing that content to our GH Pages branch, so it'll update our live site. So I'm going to probably sign off. I've been on for about an hour now, and I'll make those changes. But again, if there's anything else you want to see or anything else you have questions about, just join me tomorrow. Usually I'm on around noon EST. I've been getting on a little bit earlier, again, just to kind of help out with my daughters while my wife is recovering from giving birth and surgery. Thanks for stopping in. Thanks for the follows. Emmy, Aregis, Slayer, Darth, and Rigster, and hope to see you guys around. Bye.